The film which you are about to see is an account of the disaster which befell two British photographers and a Russian expedition into the world's deepest cave. Both originally from the UK, cave photographers Robbie Schoen and his photo assistant Jeff Wade, who at the time were living abroad in France and Australia respectively, were both planning a spelunking trip together of a lifetime in what is today the world's deepest cave system, the Veryovkina cave. The system itself is located in the Georgian breakaway region of Abkhazia, and with an incredible depth of about 7,257 feet, or 2,212 meters, it is considered the world's deepest cave system. The system is also incredibly complex, with thousands of feet of sheer drops which only the most experienced spelunkers and adventurers could actually traverse. Well, both of our friends decided that if they were going to conquer this behemoth of an adventure that lay ahead of them, that they were going to need some help. And so they decided to join a group of Russians who are all members of the Spelo caving team, an official group of world-class cavers from Moscow who themselves have been pushing many of the explorations to Veryovkina and the other four incredibly deep cave systems around the mountain range. These members included Pavel Demidov, Petr Lyubimov, Konstantin Zverev, Andrei Shuvalov, Yevgeny Rubika, Andrei Ziznikov, Andrei Siskov, Roman Zverev, and Natalia Sizakova, and the team just recently made an incredible achievement by reaching a terminal slump at the water table, being able to reach the incredible depth of about 7,257 feet or 2,212 meters, which by this time was now a new low point record in the caving community, knocking the Krubrera cave at 7,208 feet or 2,197 meters into second place. And now in September of 2018, the team were planning on exploring a number of promising horizontal leads at the bottom of Veryovkina cave system. They wanted to collect samples of rare and possibly new species of shrimp and scorpions, and also wanted to leverage Robbie's photographic skills to help them document the entire cave, including the beautiful terminals. As the team was traversing the system, it would end up taking them 4 days to completely descend to the bottom of the cave. All the while, the spelunkers had traversed down thousands of feet of ropes and sheer drops, crawled through water and mud, choked siphons, and squeezed themselves in all their heavy gear through some of the most torturous and improbable cracks that the cave had to offer. The team would then set up camp at about the 2,200 meter mark, which to their benefit was a flat sandy spot in a horizontal tunnel. The team would then end up spending 3 full days at this depth, as they would end up launching multiple explorations into the new corridors, taking pictures and collecting invertebrate specimens. Later on, both Roman and Natalia would end up leaving early in order to catch a flight back home to Russia, leaving the other 9 to explore alone. Though on the way out, as they reached the camp at about the 1,300 meter mark, they would begin to panic a bit as they both saw a flood pulse. Knowing the danger that this would spell out for their friends below, they both rushed over to the cable wire that they had set up earlier in case of emergency, set their phones up, and were able to call their friends below to warn them. The team had already been inside the system for about a total of 7 days, and so by this time they were already pretty exhausted and just trying to conserve their energy for the climb all the way back up. At first though, the team below wasn't too concerned about it, as flood pulses in this cave system are a lot more common than one might think. Usually heavy rain can cause a huge pool to form, which then suddenly bursts through the cave opening, which then the ensuing flood pulse can then last a few minutes or even hours, but then eventually will subside. The team also wasn't too worried, especially because their campsite was safely adjacent to the main vertical shaft that was actually spewing out the massive amounts of water at this point. And for the most part, everyone was staying dry, so they all felt confident in their own safety. But just then, one of the Russian team members, Petr, noticed a rather loud gurgling sound coming from a small hole in the ground near the tent. He couldn't see any water coming out of the hole yet, though at this time the flood pulse had been raging for over 2 hours with no signs of stopping, though to them it warranted enough of a concern. They then checked a nearby siphon in hopes that the water table hadn't risen yet since the last time they checked. Everything seemed fine at first, But then not even 5 minutes later, after they got back to the campsite, Petr went back to look down the small hole near the tent. And unfortunately this time, he saw water rising up so fast that it started bouncing off the cave walls. And just then, Petr turned around to the others with his face as though he just had seen a ghost, leading Robbie to think that they couldn't wait any longer and that they all had to go, otherwise they would end up dying very horrible deaths over a mile into the earth. Originally, they weren't planning on going anywhere that day, but immediately everyone started scrambling for their gear. All the while, floodwaters continued to rip through the main chasm, the roar of it sounding like a freight train. Then, in a split decision without hesitation, Robbie decided to leave all his camera and personal gear behind. Literally tens of thousands of dollars in equipment. He knew though that they had at least a half a mile of intense climbing ahead of them before they could get into any safety, so he left it all behind. Though, out of everything, he made sure to grab his camera's flashcards, as they contained the only pictures ever taken of Veryovkina's terminals. So he placed them in a Ziploc bag and slipped them into his latex suit. Then suddenly, Jeff was nowhere to be seen in all the chaos that was ensuing. So Robbie would then yell out in panic, "Jeff, come on! Jeff, we have to leave now! I'm on my way, I'm coming!" Jeff would yell back through the thunderous stream coming down. And then Jeff turned to Petr and said, "We're going! We gotta get out of here now!" "Go," Petr said. "I'll wait for Pavel and the others." That was then the last interaction that Robbie and Jeff would have with the Russian at the low camp, and the two were off. As the two were heading up, they reached a precarious traverse, which before was above an airy shaft about 8 meters wide and 20 meters deep. Well, now that shaft was completely filled with water. Luckily though, they were able to traverse it with little trouble. They then reached the vertical ropes that would be one of their more challenging climbs. He looked up, saw a raging waterfall pouring over them. They then looked at each other, took a deep breath, clipped their ascenders on the rope, put their heads down, and began their climb. The incredible weight of the water absolutely beating them both. It barreled down with such crushing, intense, suffocating force. It felt as though my head was being crushed into my shoulders. He then tucked his chin into his chest and was able to breathe from an air pocket formed by the space created beneath his helmet brim. And luckily, being able to move as fast as he could, using a technique he learned when he was a window washer, pushing a mechanical ascender up the rope, transitioning past belays and knots. All I could see was a white rope in front of me, Robbie thought to himself. And I just kept moving the ascender up a little bit at a time, thinking to myself, just keep going, just keep doing this. Just then, Robbie was able to reach an area where he could step to the side of the turret. He then looked up to see where the rope was running, which it led to a body-sized chimney of rock through which the floodwater was being furiously pumped through. Robbie then just sat there and thought to himself, "You're joking. I physically can't get through that. Where am I supposed to go now?" As unfortunately, there was no airspace or literally anything to get by. But Robbie knew that as lead man, they hadn't climbed high enough to be to safety yet. And he knew that everyone would shortly be coming up behind him, so he had to keep climbing no matter what. So Robbie started to climb into the narrow shaft, forcing his way up all the while. The water that was pouring over him was so punishing, he was only able to push his ascenders up only a few inches up at a time, only being able to take short sips of air as he ascended up. All the while thinking to himself, I really hope everyone else is able to climb through this as well, knowing almost how impossible it was. Then Robbie kept climbing as fast and as high as he could. After a bit, he was able to climb to a relatively dry area where luckily the flood had taken a different direction. And luckily, that was when Jeff was able to call to Robbie from below. Robbie, slow down. We're safe for now, just slow down," Jeff would yell angrily. That's when Robbie reached an anchor and decided to wait for Jeff there. By the time Jeff reached him, Robbie noticed how Jeff's face was pale white and that his eyes were massively open wide, and all he had to say was, "Bloody hell, we're still alive." Then they realized the same might not be able to be said about their Russian friends who were still below. Though luckily, the two of them were then able to climb to the camp at about the 1900 meter mark, where the team still had a tent up that was stacked with food and medical supplies for when the team was on the climb back up. All the while, the rumble of the flood continued to vibrate the floor beneath them. Then, after a few minutes had passed, both Robbie and Jess decided to peer over the ledge into the dark abyss down below, and with sheer luck was able to see a single headlamp appear through the surging waters around it. It was Andrei Ziznikov, but he was alone, and as soon as he reached the camp, Robbie asked whether or not he had seen the others, but unfortunately, he had not seen them. The three then just sat there and prayed, all three of them hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. Though almost like a scene from a movie, about 15 minutes later, more headlamps began to appear through the raging waters. One by one, each of the remaining 5 Russians were able to make it to the camp. "I couldn't believe it," Robbie said. "These guys were so strong and capable." One of them had even carried up a pack with 4 sleeping bags, a stove, and a brew kit, though in all reality, the Russians had only escaped by a small hair, as when Pavel had just returned from checking the siphon after the gurglings in the small hole. And right after Robbie and Jeff had left, their chamber was rushed with floodwater and they had to swim to even get to the ropes to climb to safety. On top of that, Pavel actually got caught in an eddy that sent him spinning like he was going down a drain, though luckily he was able to fight the current and swim as hard as he could to reach the ropes. The team, now reunited, would spend the next 16 hours at the camp, though the Russians, being more experienced spelunkers, were all relaxed and laughing with each other over the experience. Though unfortunately for Robbie, he was still pretty freaked out about the whole thing, as he kept his caving gear on the whole time, couldn't sleep, and kept peering over the ledge into the dark abyss below to see if any of the water was rising to their location. All the while, the entire time, the flood would continue through the entire night. And though really his main concern was about a pseudo-siphon about 70 meters or 229 feet above their heads. The long horizontal tunnel was normally half filled with water, and under normal conditions, the only way through was to crawl. Now meaning that with this flood, it was now impossible, and that they were now trapped as long as the flood waters were still coming. Fortunately though, after a few hours of pacing, Robbie was able to relax and even strip down to get comfortable. That's when Pavel would tell Robbie, "Let's just give it until morning," and he was right. Robbie remembers hearing the water get less and less powerful until almost nothing, all by morning. The flood pulse had ultimately lasted an incredible 20 hours straight from the result of a week straight of raining. And unfortunately, the Russians were under the impression that Veryovkina only flooded during the winter, which wasn't true, as they all knew now. And fortunately, despite the flood cutting the trip short by a day, their trip was a complete success, as they were still able to map new passageways, take back several cave invertebrates back for analysis, and a number of climbs were completed to check potential high-level passageways, which was really only them scratching the surface as to what this system might actually hold. Only a couple hours later, Pavel and a couple of the other guys decided to go back for everyone's stuff that was left behind. And unfortunately, Robbie's camera was completely destroyed, and one of Robbie's lights was smashed against the roof of the cave, of which they decided to leave it there, creating a signal and perhaps hopefully letting future spelunkers know how high flood waters can actually rise in this deadly cave system. And once again, thank you for watching. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and turn on the notification bell for more content in the future. Goodbye for now.